Inspector Gadget and the Forge of Hate, written by Aaron Weinstock. Prologue. In the dawn of a new day, in the early months of 1991, deep within a mountain named Everfrost, which has been carved out to serve a purpose in Warland, Montana, resides an organization named Skolex Enterprises, and its employees are up to no good. They are dedicated to performing deeds of evil, and are gearing up to make their work more covert and efficient, by way of plans put into action by some of its workers, who have yet to gain high ranking within its sculpted walls of concrete, rock, metal, and plaster. Where, in the depths of this constructed den of wrongdoing, the plans are happening are in a lab. Only 2 employees here feel the thrill of their work, plus what they are trying to do. Their subjects, however, feel lightly otherwise, that while they do too work for Skolex Enterprises, they are the ones who will soon find out if the 2 doctor-titled workers truly know what they are doing, as the men and women of their bosses will imposed over them, by way of their neglecting to read the fine print of their work papers, signed. Await what is coming to them. The Morceris of the 2 professional scientists readies the lab's equipment for their experiment and takes note of his colleague. Dr. Focus, not pleased by his younger equal with less experience on the job, glared at him. Because of that, to the actions being done by the co-worker, Dr. Claw does not look at all professional, at least though to a man of his standing, and more importantly to who he works for. In withholding of his feelings about his assistant, Dr. Focus calmly asked, "Herd them into the containment area. We are almost ready to begin." A demand which caught Dr. Claw off guard, in addition to also not at first realizing to whom or what Dr. Focus was requesting of him, the pen of mewing kittens having had his attention better of the course of the last few minutes in the lab than the job at hand he'd been assigned to do, the debate in his mind resolving fast as he petted a fluffy gray-striped tabby, who in turn also rubbed against him. His colleague meant the men and women present, not the animals. But as the gray-striped tabby kitten pawed his hands, his focus didn't stay long with the words of Dr. Focus. The other doctor, in noting this, knew his duty to his job, and his equal, still wet behind the ears, grabbed away Dr. Claw from the litter of penned animals and scowled him. You can't be a bad guy if you get too attached to the lab animals. Plus, it doesn't reflect well on you either. Skolex is run by the mob, and gains its funding from that. Remember that. Cutting and being snapped coldly to Dr. Claw came the words from Dr. Focus. Dr. Claw's reaction in pulling out of Dr. Focus's grip came that of just a nod and a look back to the cats. Again, noting the man's actions, Dr. Focus grabbed Dr. Claw's head and snapped it in the direction of the waiting employees in the doorway of the room. Them, not the kittens. Dr. Focus continued making his point to the younger man. Do we have to do this? I mean, it's clear this is mad, Focus. What you 2 are trying to do with us? Asked the human lab rat, more into the room than the others grouped behind him. Nervous and trying to control within him the grape juice drank a few hours before, he, like those with him, didn't feel keen on the idea about what fate was about to befall him. A good one, he hoped, but his gut and his bladder told him otherwise. First off, what you don't want the power this will give you? You will be the most untouchable hitman Skolex Enterprises has ever had. Plus, you agreed to this in your contracts. Second off, never call my work mad. Dr. Focus nearly growled at the men, as Dr. Claw moved to try and force them to comply with their orders. Knowing it was a battle that couldn't be won, they complied, and Dr. Claw watched them move onto a platform in readiness for the experiment. One employee, a friend of Dr. Claw, looked at him emotionless while passing him by. The look, while showing nothing in his facial features, told Dr. Claw his thoughts. This was a mistake, but one that must be made, and heaven help him for that in their friendship, thought once had. Once the employees not specialized in rank title, like the doctors, all stood in waiting for science of unprecedented nature to be performed, it began by both Dr. Focus and Claw becoming dead serious in their work, then beginning to run their specialized equipment attached to the platform. The experiment, seemed well for a short time, but then a noted realization came soon that made the tide of favor held for the work change. monitoring a computer of the latest high-tech to the moment, also ready to punch in commands to it to have it interact differently with its surrounding equipment. Dr. Claw saw readouts on its screen that didn't look right, not expected, and far from being desired, a matter needing to be pointed out to Dr. Focus. "Doctor, I think we should probably abort this." "Nonsense, continue," his foul mood continuing in reply from earlier. Dr. Focus, his mind made up that given this was new territory being walked upon here, that unpredictable things are inevitable to happen. A word of caution given by a coworker less experienced, that isn't as professional as he, not worth further consideration of his words. In compliance to his equal/higher on the seniority ladder coworker, words of orders, Dr. Claw continued trying to further perform their experiment on the men and women on the platform. Looking up for one moment from the computer he'd been working with, he saw what his actions and the actions of Dr. Focus combined were doing to them. The people, the lab rats as Dr. Focus would call them, their bodies now looked to be filling with light of rainbow shades. An impressive sight, but not one wanted. With one key punched in number command, Dr. Claw tried to fix the problem. Then the problem erupted in a flash of light that consumed the room for just mere moments. The flash over, and body in pain, with blindness to his eyes, Dr. Focus asked, "My lab rats, how are you?" No answer came, and Dr. Claw, like that of his colleague in health, pain, and blindness, questioned the forced darkness of his surroundings as well, but with a different question. Also, a discovery which showed no inflections in Dr. Focus's voice, although apparent in his throat to his voice, a feeling of hoarseness when talking. Welker, his friend and lab rat to him and Dr. Focus, didn't answer the question, that being of status. How was he? Plus, to the blindness of both men, Focus and Claw, where was he? "It's likely a form of radiation from the overload causing our pain and blindness. We need to leave here now," Dr. Focus cried out, feeling his way past his main workstation in the lab into the area's more open space. "I have one task I need to do first," Dr. Claw replied with fear building in him over their situation. That also applied to others present, not human. "There's no time to turn off the equipment. This could kill us," Dr. Focus snapped as he started to feel around to find his work companion. Not paying attention to his colleague, Dr. Claw set to his task. That unlike Dr. Focus in his blind search to find him, Claw found what his task demanded of him faster, the feel of soft fur beneath one reaching out hand. Taking in the cat to his lab coat, that added cuddling him. He knew without his sight it was the cat he had at this point only mildly bonded with, then proceeded to feel around for the rest of its litter. To no avail could he locate them, and further searching in desperation got halted in short time. Dr. Focus in his blind search found him, then grabbing him by his scruff, the back of his coat, pulled him out of the room with him, the kitten in Dr. Claw's coat pocket in tow with them. Chapter 1. Bobbing lightly on the waves moves the SS Hush Puppy in mid-morning of a near cloudless sky, out on the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of South Carolina. The boat is small, but that fact doesn't seem to bother its occupants. It is just the right size for a small family, the one that owns it. A father named Preston, a mother named Sky, and a daughter named Penny, all tied together by the last name of Bianchi. But through the mother and daughter, maiden and blood, the name Hayward. This outing on their boat is just a normal Saturday morning event for them, a gathering away from work and school, one they've done countless times. That isn't to say it's lost its enjoyment at being commonplace in their lives. Far from that, as Penny smiles, while her dad checks with her to ensure she's ready to dive into the water of the ocean with him. These checks being over their diving gear, clothes, and gadgets meant to keep them alive underwater. Sky, as a good mom, watches both her daughter and husband at a short distance, making sure on her own neither future diver forgets about safety. Then reminds them that if they find something interesting, like sunken treasure, that they are to return to it with the boat for her to have. Preston taking his normal lead into the ocean, once all his gear is fixed in proper place, then signaling for Penny to follow him. Watches as moments later she dives in close by to him. That closeness being another normal thing in this routine of the Saturday morning diving excursion. Her nearly aiming her jump almost on top of him, an act only achieved once, and long ago, to her grateful father, when her idea of a cannonball was new and she herself was nearly the size Preston considered to be a real cannonball. Knowing where he considers a choice location to be under the waves, he prompts the young 8-year-old girl to follow him yet again, this time to a wrecked catamaran that, as both of them approach it, realize its wait for them to explore it has been going on for a good number of years. Sea life of plants and primitive animals have taken hold of massive swaths of its hull. If the pair cared for beauty in sea transportation, this would have been a disappointment. Luckily for them, it wasn't the saltwater life-shown age of the beast, what inspired their awe in it, but its interior that got their attention, with what surprises it might hold. A vessel as large as a cat, surely before sinking, likely had not had all its possessions removed before its owners or travelers and staff abandoned it. As the father and daughter started their exploration of its interior, taking in its sights which told how long it had been sitting on the ocean's bottom, by way of markings which had dates on them, magazines, newspapers, and what had been the most recent maps available at the time, the boat had been launched on its fatal journey. They both took in what was left behind of value in it, which, much to both their disappointment, could not be brought back to the surface again to be turned over to others for money. Sights of things like an old radio, stereo equipment, and a beautiful lamp that once had value, now had lost it. Useless machines now, even if the lamp's art, at least to the eye, was pleasing to its appearance. Feeling bummed, and not knowing what to do next in salvaging the journey's purpose, Penny seated herself in a chair she could only guess that once upon a time most likely had been the ship captain's chair. Leather, and very elaborate looking in its wooden framing. It too wasn't as pretty a sight as she was sure it had been long ago, although, as she sulked, she got a surprise from her dad that changed her mood. After he spun around the chair she was sitting in to face him, he presented her with his latest find, a bracelet that, after all the neglect it had suffered for years, still had its metal shining yellow, and its gemstones reflecting in shades of green and blue. A fine emerald and topaz piece of jewelry. Penny squealed with joy at its sight, forgetting her mood from just a moment before. The current feelings of joy at her dad's discovery soon changed when a visitor to their expedition entered the cabin with them. A shark, a big shark, and it matched nothing Penny had ever read about. Knowing his daughter was in danger, Preston swung at the creature to hit it. A price got paid for the motion of defense, but not the wanted one. A bite from the shark to the man, not a big one, but enough to rip through his diving suit and mark his skin. The monster shark then froze in place after the attack and watched the man. It watched Penny too as she looked back and forth from it to her father. It made no move whatsoever as she and her father looked at the bleeding wound, cut by many teeth marks and one strangely shaped bite mark. It didn't look as bad as it could have been, Preston noted. The shark not moving now helped the matter to his thoughts, given he knew this wasn't normal behavior for them. One bite, and at that, not very deep into him. He knew this could have been much worse, that if it had acted like a normal shark, it would have kept on biting him. Handing Penny the prized find of the trip, he motioned to her it was time to go, the man looking around the cabin as he did so, first to his daughter, then to the ocean out beyond them, and then to the strange shark. After Penny nodded her acknowledgement, and started to swim out from where they'd entered the cabin from, that is when things took a turn for the worse. As Preston started swimming behind Penny, he noticed something new about his injured arm. The puncture marks from the shark bite were starting to grow on him and deepen. New marks of sunken-in teeth were appearing on him, plus drawing out blood from him as they did so. The new pain they were causing him, becoming more unbearable as tooth marks spread out on him. It made him lose sight of the moment and panic. Noticing the streaming of blood starting to pass by her from behind, Penny looked behind her to its source. The sight she got was of her father flailing in the water as more and more of the marks appeared on him. The blood flow from his body to the ocean as it became greater by the moment made it look like the man was being enveloped by a cloud of crimson smoke. Penny panicked at the sight, and tears in her eyes rushed to his aid. The result in that came as an horrific shock to both father and daughter as she made it to him, that in reaching out to him to take hold of him, she couldn't. Her hand passed right through him as he waved about in pain and distress at his predicament. She couldn't touch him. A ghost is all the consistency he seemed to have at the moment. But the pain on his face was very real. His flesh seemed very real even though she couldn't touch it. His expression as the tooth marks entered onto his face was one of utter sadness for everything that was upon not only him, but her too. In a panic of her own, in not knowing what to do next, Penny motioned to him. She was about to surface, her goal in not abandonment of him truly, but getting help. Her mother and his wife, she knew there was extra snorkeling gear on board the SS Hush Puppy with her. She, Penny's mom, would know what to do, would know how to fix this and make her father well again. Once surfacing from the water and climbing back on board the ship, Penny looked about for Skye, but the woman was not where she had once been. Exploring in further on the Hush Puppy, in trying to find her, she did. Skye was laying on the deck of the boat, and not moving. The reason for the lack of movement wasn't a matter of choice. Penny noted with more fear and anxiety building in her. Her reason, her mother's reason for being still was because she was dead, shot in the chest, and bleeding in a red pool growing on the wooden surface she lay upon. Skye's eyes watched her namesake, with no contemplation at all as the sky rolled onwards with its clouds uncaring to her. Penny screamed then and ran to her with her discovery. The child, in grief not knowing what to do at all, bent over her mom. Although unknown to her at first, something she had not noticed its existence until making its presence known, did in fact know how to handle this situation. A wolf watching her attempt to hold her mom, and getting only failure with passing through her, as if Skye were nothing more than a phantom. The animal went through a doorway to the girl and parent from the boat's only hold, its intent clear, its target in range, and ever so close. Penny finally noticing the wolf through her tear-filled eyes. When it growled, it looked to be a creature of nightmares to her, flickering red eyes that glowed, fur mushed this way and that, with all sorts of color variations, that for either wolf or dog made it impossible to judge what type of canine it was exactly. Pointed ears and metal claws, it snapped at her, before it lunged at her. Penny screamed again now, but out loud, and in her bedroom. Brain jumped off the freshly awoken 16-year-old. Startled, not only the bed he was lying on with her, being suddenly put under its covers, put in motion, but also the shriek of his master's voice near, in his ears. He barked at her in a whimper once standing on all fours on the ground by her. Crying, she sat in the bed and just looked at him for a while before decided action was needed. Slowly she reached over to her pet, to stroke one of his paws, which he sat on the bed's rim for her. The first pet of him being assurance he was there, and could be touched. The following pets she gave him. Those were for a different reasoning, comfort for not only her, but also for the curious dog, who knew nothing of the dream she just woke up from. Her next action, once having petted the dog, for some time before he decided he'd had enough distance petting and needed it more close up, she grabbed her cell phone and dialed it, to the one person she knew could comfort her more than Brain in her times of need. As she sat in her bed's covers, she petted the dog more as it tried to climb onto her lap, as the phone rang and rang while the pet moved around on her. She worried why her uncle wasn't answering his phone as fast as he normally would to her calling him. Outside a barn in the town of Zala, Libya, the call went unanswered for a time. That is, until it dawned on the man receiving the call. It is what he knows has to be a very personal call, given it's coming through on his pinky finger, personal phone. Some things can't firmly be put off, and even with knowing his attention is needed elsewhere at the moment, just to satisfy the caller, his niece. He's sure, since surely work wouldn't call him while already on a job. Inspector John Hayward, sometimes called Inspector Gadget, finally lifted the nail on his left pinky finger to answer the call. "Penny, I'm at work right now," he half shouted into the receiver under the lifted nail face, then listening to the speaker in his thumb to hear her reply. That despite how it sounded, that of her being emotionally distraught, he knew that even thought he had taken this time to heed her reaching out to him. He still couldn't really help her. She needed his time right now, and it felt like the matter was urgent. But that didn't hold a candle to what he knew was taking place where he was right then. A person that was such a rapscallion of a character was in the barn, and he had committed such a crime, one so upside down as that John and his co-worker, Alan Engenes, who was sometimes called Corporal Caveman, both men saw it as a matter that, while seeming strange, had to be dealt with fast as a matter of pride. Plus to that, also the reputation of Happy. To the party they knew had to be sore about the upside-down crime. The person they once thought to be its victim, now known not to be so. Feeling truly like a bad person for his actions, plus attempting to lighten the sorrow-filled heart of his niece, John replied to her in brief about needing to be part from her at that moment. "Penny, we will talk about this in depth when I get back home. I know you had an awful dream, but a very bad man is about to be dealt with by Alan and I. We are about to enter a barn where we're told he'll be. Honey, camel stealing in this country is a very serious thing, and these wrongdoers must be brought to justice." From the other end of the phone, he heard her laugh before querying about what the crime really was. "Camels, Penny. 2-3 humped camels. Listen, I really need to go right now. I can hear them neighing in the barn. That criminal Alan and I need to deal with is one nasty piece of work. Love you, bye," John replied to her before ending the call abruptly. By closing down the nail of his personal phone, Alan dropped the smile he'd taken on when listening to his friend/co-worker's silly explanation for the serious situation they were in. Now, as they were about to enter it, he saw the inspector had started to slowly open the door to the barn which contained it. The slowness being a matter the engineer had learned to expect with John in times like these, when the inspector was wearing his personal computer over his head, with its semi-transparent panels. He was always afraid of bumping into things headlong, a wise caution, he thought, but one he felt sometimes unwarranted. Now was one of them, because the man they were about to deal with, an archaeologist named Earl Hancock, wasn't dangerous at all. No, this man is just to a good degree dumb. Alan knew right now John's slowness wasn't needed when going in to confront him for his crime. Nothing but air to bump into but hot air. When they entered the barn, they saw that the archaeologist had been brought to his victim's idea of justice to some sort of degree. Wrong, very wrong, both Happy agents realized. But at the same time, it kept the man from running. Hancock was bound, and on the floor of the barn, face near the result of a camel's brown color given leftovers, looking like he was awaiting something worse than what fate had befallen him already. Moving to untie the man, to then, as John knew with supreme irony, was about to be handcuffed, the inspector got stopped fast from taking the action to free the man from his rope-knotted bonds. The victim, a native man gaining in his years, and owner to the place where the crime was committed, was ready to shoot John, as the Happy agent noted with the sound of a shout and click of a gun being pulled back on for firing. Raising his shown 2 hands in a sign of peacefulness, the inspector decided to try and talk with the museum owner, while Alan, unseen to the native, started to take care of the archaeologist's bonds. The personal computer, while feeling like a horrendous eyesore and clunky device, at this moment, John felt was a blessing. It would translate on its frontmost screen in reverse view for the other man to see, English to Berber and vice versa. A program in its software he wished he'd known about on other international missions, where English wasn't the land's primary language. "No untying him, I take it?" John asked the museum owner. "What is going on here? More Americans ready to thieve from me?" the wronged man asked, still ready to strike at the inspector, his words being translated on the screen as he spoke them. Knowing how violent this was getting, before he hoped a peaceful outcome, John put himself directly in between the museum owner's view of the archaeologist and Alan. Alan knew without words what this meant, then continued to work on the bound man's ropes, now as fast and quietly as he could. "Sir, this case, the quote-unquote stolen by you, key artifact that proves the Egyptian and Maya cultures did interact with each other over thousands of years ago. I've discovered the truth of the matter upon investigation. You never stole it. It was a ploy to get the artifact out of your hands and into Mr. Hancock's hands," the inspector answered as professionally as he could. Not answers really to the other man's questions. John did find it insulting he was being accused of being a thief himself. Dealing with that accusation wasn't one he felt like tackling, Given how it was an underhanded American who was to blame for all of this, although bringing that real thief to justice, all that took was a question he hoped the dirty archaeologist would answer. That without turning to face him, John asked the now untied man the big question of the case. "Where is the artifact, Mr. Hancock? Since it's nowhere to be found, and clearly not with Mr. Tatanaki, it must be in your possession somehow." "How did you find me?" Hancock shouted, upset he'd been discovered on more than one account. Moving to finally see the dirty archaeologist again, the museum owner, Mr. Tatanaki, saw the man was free of his tied rope bonds. Further acknowledgement at truly noticing the inspector's partner, the person he knew surely had done the act of freeing the man. Then back to look at John. Coldly, he looked at John. Not a good sign in the Happy Agent's book. That's when the man that was once only the victim fired his gun. The shot, while not shattering the plastic panel of John's personal computer, did splinter it into a webbing of rings which circled outward from the bullet's impact. No harm done, but that. The panel, now useless, made John start to internally panic more than he had been already. No translator and no personal understanding of Berber. Plus, the person he needed to settle down from having been violated was in fact now doing more criminal acts than what had been noticed of the archaeologist once entering the barn. "We'd been given information you'd be here. We just didn't know the why behind it," John answered before gulping in air and continuing, "till now." The inspector attempted not to look at the man nervously as the other stood up and rubbed himself where the rope had been on him. Alan watched the thief as well, but if he was nervous, he was hiding it well. The man was smiling in his normal Cheshire Cat way. That didn't help John when noticing it to keep himself in check. Knowing what Alan's smiles normally meant, John asked him what the other was thinking that could make things get abruptly worse. "Alan, what are you thinking of doing?" "Oh, nothing. Nothing for my actions. Him, he is so boned," Alan said, in hooking a thumb at Hancock, to then laugh a little after saying his reply, and 2 cents to the moment. The museum owner shouted, and then the engineer refrained back to looking professional. The inspector then also continued as best he could with handling the case by questioning the archaeologist. Words now spoken by the gun-wielding man, in a sense fallen upon deaf ears, considering neither Happy Agent could understand him. They got the drift of his meaning nonetheless. "Again, Mr. Hancock, where is the artifact?" John questioned the dirty archaeologist again. "I couldn't give it back to him right now even if I wanted to." Hancock glared as he spoke his reply. "What is that supposed to mean?" John further questioned him, feeling confused by the man's odd statement. Looking none too happy to give a reply, and feeling lightly embarrassed by what the reply was, Earl Hancock motioned with one of his feet to the camel dung he'd been near, when he'd been on the ground. "It's in the camel poop?" John questioned the man, wide-eyed and in shock at the thought. Noticing the pale look on the archaeologist's face, Alan voiced his thoughts over the motion they'd just witnessed. "Inspector, I think that means he swallowed it." "Oh, great," John stated, thinking about how the situation, once simply bad, had turned worse, and now felt like what his niece had said she had just gone through, a nightmare. Again, Tatanaki shouted, and hearing the additional noises, the sounds of something being lifted with the of scraping metal against the floor of the barn. This got the Happy Agent's attention back to him. He, now after having shouted, and now holding a pitchfork, both inspector and engineer knew without translation what he was saying, and what he intended to do, waving the tool in the air before charging in their direction, but more specifically towards the archaeologist. The shout and motions and running, all meaning that the museum owner now intended to remove the artifact from the one man in the room, not a Happy Agent, by force. That's when inspector and engineer knew also the next action they needed to take in this case assignment. Alan grabbed Hancock by one arm, in starting to force him to run with him out of the barn, while as John caught up to them, he took the other arm of the archaeologist to continue forcing on the man's movement. Breaking free from both Happy Agents, Hancock shouted at them non-directly, "I'll go with you, all right? You need to come with us, and you need a safe place. That, and you need to be loaded with laxatives, and if that doesn't work, I know of a great surgeon," John replied, with some of his wording heightened in his voice as they ran, while he spoke. The reasoning behind heightening his voice was to make it clear to the archaeologist that the man had done wrong, and the inspector fully intended to correct those wrongs. As the happy agents continued running to safety, the archaeologist stopped in his tracks, thinking of John's words. As he saw Tatanaki starting to catch up with him, the idea now fully sinking into his head, jail was coming for him, if he continued on with the men. Added also that he would soon be being met with a very uncomfortable doctor's appointment too, which would be worse, dealing with the pissed-off local museum owner and his pitchfork, or the protection agency he had frauded. Alan stopped him in his train of thought, and grabbed him as the museum owner, pitchfork being carried over his head, readied himself to strike at Hancock as he was catching up with the man, now only a few yards away from him. "It's people like you that give Indiana Jones a bad name," Alan shouted at Hancock as both men, that with the engineer forcing the archaeologist, caught up with the inspector, still in a headlong run. "Those 4 movies are a crock to my field of work," Hancock snapped in reply to Alan. "There are only 3. I refuse to believe there's a 4th, Alan replied back. "Knock it off, you two," John shouted without turning back to look at them, as he ran with them, trailing behind him, into an open garage holding the modded 1983 Toyota Supra that he and Alan started calling the Gadget-Mobile regularly a few missions into them working together. Reaching the car, John quickly grabbed out his keys and, using the right one, opened the driver's door, to then, from a button within the vehicle, unlock all at once all the other doors to the machine, catching himself on the outside of the car with his personal computer, before in practiced fast action, removing the gadget bit by bit from his head. Alan, reaching the car, ripped open the rear passenger door, then threw in Hancock to the Gadget-Mobile before he too entered the car. John then locked all the car's doors, before ripping out of the open garage as fast as the car could move. As far as safety was concerned in this, only the dirty archaeologist in the car's back seat was concerned. That is, until an automated feature of the car kicked in, at the vehicle's sensors realizing the machine's passengers were unsecured. Moving by robotic motors, the midsection backseat seat belts wrapped themselves across the man. A yipe of surprise and widening eyes was his only reaction to this. The men in the front of the car thought nothing of it, but one of them knew the car needed to have at least one more of its extra functions kick in before they'd all be safe. Well, at least in his book. "John, press the new button," Alan asked the man, grinning. "Alan, we don't need the car to spout wings and tail and fly. That has yet to be tested. Now is not the right time for that. Plus, the cargo carrier that brought us here is already on standby for us. That is what we are doing," the inspector replied, smacking away Alan's reaching hand for one of the car's dashboard control panels. Chapter 2. Not thrilled with where she was, Penny yawned moments before looking at the clock on the wall in her homeroom classroom. It read 8:57 a.m. That meant in 3 minutes a boring day was about to begin. First period English class. She felt overjoyed in a sarcastic sense about that prospect. That given if it wasn't for every adult she knew personally, all insisting she not join her uncle on his latest case assignment from Happy, she's be hopefully learning here and there Arabic and Berber, not a language she'd been forced to study, for nearly as far back as she could remember in her whole life of having to go to school. Knowing that despite this day felt like a waste of time, she did remember there was at least one important aspect of it, a test she had to take in her 4th period Earth Science class. This made her pull its associated book out from her backpack and take hold of the highlighter she on school days would carry in her pants pocket, then begin using it to help make notes in the book of what she should know. Fletcher, a boy just behind her in seating, noticed what she was up to. Penny's actions, he knew, were wrong, but making that point to her? He knew what he wanted to do and couldn't, although that didn't stop him from mimicking the idea in hand motions, making a spyglass shape with his hands and leaning over her as best he could before saying, "You know that's wrong, writing in textbooks. You could get in trouble for that if you get caught." Stopping her note-making for a second, she looked behind herself to him. She saw him making an ever one hand adjusting for focus spyglass at her, before returning her attention to her work, then replying to him and sighing as she did so. "I don't care, and what is that? Your idea of a camera?" He slunk back into resting in his seat before replying, "Spyglass. I don't know how to make a camera shape with my hands." To Penny's right side, Kayla, who'd been watching the whole exchange between her friends, then voiced her thoughts while making a box shape with her fingers, which involved tapping her right pointer finger against her left middle finger, touching the other hand in the box shape. She said, smiling, "This is how you make a camera with your hands, Fletch." Then, in turning to Penny, Kayla added, "Don't be a grump, Pen. So what if you can't have your education held abroad today?" Without looking to Kayla, Penny stopped in her studying and note-taking to reply, her intermood of sarcasm now surfacing in her voice. Yeah, Northern Africa is too dangerous for a little old teenage girl to be. Yeah, ol' uncle, and half the places I've been with you around the globe have been totally safe places to be." When Fletcher replied to her with, "But those places didn't have the same history to them, and currently have hot spots of bloodshed in them," she continued again with her work, and to make point, that of being a little upset, and also that she didn't care for him pointing out about her use of the highlighter in the book. She smashed it into the page of the textbook she'd been reading. Seeing that in the one male friend of their circle wasn't making Penny's day any better, Kayla spoke up again, and tried again to help her out. "Metro City Western High, Penny. U.S. taxes ensured better education, without James Bond crap on the sidelines, and possibly better food at lunchtime." Giving up, Penny slammed her book shut with noticing also it was now 9 a.m. Roll call was now starting, and a teacher was now present in the room. Feeling disapproval for the rules had no place at this moment in time, and she didn't feel like giving detention. Seeing the teacher start to scan the room and calling out names as he did so, she also pocketed her highlighter, just in case the teacher realized she might have been breaking those rules before he noticed her. The teacher, when seeing her after calling out her name, sighed in relief at noticing the girl, because out of the school year so far, consisting of 180 days, that in note the teenager had been transferred to Metro City Western High 51 days into it. Penny Hayward had only spent 40% of them actually in school, and not overseas somewhere in danger. Knowing for once she was in his classroom brightened his day, but also made him wonder a little what was going on. Unlike him, that he felt for once content. He noticed she was far from that feeling by the look on her face. Once roll call and the school's morning announcements were over, Penny, along with her friends, left their homeroom with their fellow peers. As they went in the directions in the hallway needed to get to first period class assignment dictated, Fletcher parted from her and Kayla, his first period class being math, and not what his lady friends had to deal with. The pair of teenage girls both loathed their shared first class of the day, and walked towards its room lazily, talking all the while until Penny noticed something. Straying into the front lobby of the building, to take a longer path to get to where they needed to be, was a kid that she'd seen around the school, but shared no classes with. A boy that didn't seem too social, and right now had a look about him she'd come to recognize, but not from school, or normal everyday life outside that prison. She knew it from seeing people on her uncle's cases, what crazed rage looked like when it was about to surface. Mad agents had it all too often, and this boy had that look about him. "Pen?" Kayla questioned her friend as the other girl stood in place, analyzing the pier she'd chosen to study. Without answering Kayla verbally, Penny grabbed her wrist, then forced the girl to start to move with her from the lobby. The sudden action being a surprise, and feeling very out of place to knowing her friend's normal behavior, Kayla broke free of Penny and questioned her. "What is wrong?" "I don't know his name, but that guy who's always keeping his distance from others, all of us. He has a gun. We need to leave here and go to the office and report him," Penny replied in an ear whisper, snapping and looking very scared as she did so. "Nonsense, Pen. You've been having so many adventures. You see bad guys everywhere you go. Relax," Kayla stated to her, the disbelief in her voice clear. Also, not at all in a whisper, but at normal volume. Not hearing where the conversation had started, but knowing it likely centered on him, the loner peer with the gun most of the way concealed, decided now was when he should take action. He grabbed out the gun and pointed it at Kayla. That's when she froze, plus also every student passing through the area. Only a few said more than the frightened 17-year-old with the gun pointed at her. that of whimpering in one stream. Not knowing what to do, all she could do was make a squeak noise in terror as she stared at the pistol aimed at her. "It's all pointless, and you counted that too, walking trash," the boy said calmly, as if what he was doing was nothing at all. Then, walking towards the pair of girls at a steady pace, he continued talking, still pointing the gun at her, but not noticing what was being done by one of the school's football players present in the lobby. As the loner continued in saying he thought life was pointless, and she'd be the first of many in the school that he'd end their suffering, the only other teenager present in that place had lacked some of the fear felt by nearly everyone witness to the event. The football player ran for the loner and tackled him. A wise move in ending the terrifying scene, but only to a point. The failure in not making it end in total is what happened when the loner fell to the ground. One shot fired from the gun, done in shock by the boy at the unexpected embrace from the jock at forceful impact. The bullet hit Kayla, but only by the smallest of fractions. It grazed her just above one of her hips, then hit another student that had been standing in shock with everyone else. She was only a few feet behind Kayla. Unlike Kayla's wound by the bullet, that of being minor, with the kid behind her, got it in the same area, but a few inches inward. The bullet struck organs, and the peer fell to the ground at the same time as the loner. "Go Varsity!" got shouted by someone that no one cared to take note of. Everyone's attention was not on the person that had made the statement in questionable taste, but on the deranged boy and the victims he'd created. The noises combined of a shriek one student had let out at seeing the gun when it had been drawn out on Kayla, the sound of the gunshot, plus the added sound of a sharp cry from the more injured victim. These sounds brought in staff Penny had hoped to contact in the school's office and also from elsewhere in the building. Details is all the principal could think to ask, as with panic he took in the sight of the scene, then quickly picked what felt like the bigger priority. Not the loner boy being well constricted to the floor of the lobby, but the person he'd greatly injured. From out of the blue it happened, one student replied back at him, plus also looking to the teaching staff now present with him. The rest of the student crowd so stunned by the recent events, they couldn't think to add anything more to the reply, but Penny. She, as she hugged Kayla to her, as the school's freshman geography and humanities teachers studied the girl's wound to see how badly she'd been grazed, Penny continued answering the principal's question, with the additional note of she had noticed that wasn't quite true, that this event had came about without warning signs leading to it. On the third-floor level within MAD headquarters in the combat training and gym room, the lights flickered. This was nothing new, the lights acting a little odd with no reasoning behind it. At least no reasoning any of MAD's agents could begin to take guesses at. What was new, Lewis took note of with some of his coworkers, was Terry's behavior. Working on a weight-pumping machine, he watched in small amusement and worry with some of his comrades. As Terry tried to challenge them to fights, no one he approached wanted to accept his challenge, but that wasn't discouraging the elite MAD agent. He felt like he had extra energy in his system, and he needed to work it out. His machine side, his cyborg side, Lewis guessed as he changed the weight setting on the machine he was using, from forcing him to lift 100 pounds to 110 pounds, to whatever was causing the power surges affecting the lighting of the establishment. Somehow it was affecting the partially mechanical, part robotic man. Starting his workout again, Lewis had his concentration of weightlifting and worry for his buddy changed over to just his workout and a different topic. That, too, had been the focus of a number of the staff to a worried note, an agent who considered himself a work and warhorse for MAD, given his years of service extended beyond most of the other employees. Pops nearby to him lifting a dumbbell voiced his thoughts about the current situation he felt they were going to be facing soon. "I think Dr. Claw is gearing up to leave this place, Lewis." "Never. He's a part of MAD, the heart of it at its fist. Give me one reason you believe that aside from rumors from newbies," Lewis replied, struggling a little against the new added weight he'd challenged himself to. "Claw has been having some of those newbies check his jet rocket car multiple times a day, like he keeps expecting something to be wrong with it. Sabotage, I would assume, is what he thinks could happen to it. That someone is going to try and prevent him from going somewhere. He's gearing up to go somewhere, and clearly doesn't trust someone or ones here, Pops stated with his attention in the beginning first focused on Louis, then towards the end of his words to look at the other people present in the room. "Still don't believe you, you old horse," Louis replied, taking a rest and just laying on the weight machine's cushion on his back, his eyes now focused on the room ceiling. "You're all pussies," Terry shouted in anger, balling both his fists and making his arms go rigid, as he bared his teeth, then glared around the room at the other agents around him. No one wanted to fight him, and he couldn't take that. A good workout, he thought, and what better place to try and get it. Sadly, he'd noticed since when he'd become a cyborg over a month and a half back, no one seemed to have the balls to face him any more in the fight. All except one mad agent, and as he looked angrily around the room, he didn't see her. "Maybe the possible future saboteur is our elite nutcase," Pops said, smiling, looking like he wanted to laugh. "Do you want a black eye or a broken arm, Pops? Because say that kind of nonsense again, and I promise I'll give you one of those." Louis replied to the stated question of the other man, looking like he was ready to start a fight himself, starting to let disappointment sink in, that he wasn't going to be able to let off some of the energy he felt pumped with. Terry loosened up his stance, and just looked coldly at the fellow agents, just ahead of him in his field of vision. To feel not disappointed with the check to find the woman he was looking for, he should have looked behind him. Knowing her combat partner, and partner on a more intimate level, was starting to give up by observing his body motions, the Southern American specialized agent, Amazon Annie, grabbed Terry by his red hair and threw him backwards by it to the ground. Disappointment over, pain beginning. Welcomed pain and a good fight. Terry was thrilled. His time in this place now didn't feel for naught. Every standing agent nearby to the pair gave them a wide berth to fight in, plus even a few agents not in their path of destruction. Realizing it was just good common sense, given one of the two could do damage well beyond normal body length and reach, also backed out of the way of the two. Romance in Halloween-like terror is how most everyone saw the relationship between Terry and Annie. Somehow it worked between them, and shockingly enough, the fights seemingly being unevenly matched, somehow it was 50-50 which one would win in their fights. Today was Annie's turn, as once again, as she got Terry to the floor, and he smiled at the act for a time, at least until she started to crush his skull. That's when his outlook on the fight changed, as he started mouthing the word stop, with slowly coming to say it verbally, staring out across the floor mat they both were on. Terry saw a sight, as the lights of the room flickered again, something he wondered if he was hallucinating. A person that didn't seem to quite be there was watching him from across the room. The watcher's appearance was that of a ghost, or at least what Terry assumed a ghost could look like. Faded and transitioning between different areas of the light color spectrum erratically is what the man looked to be, a ghost or a concussion. The elite mad agent wondered this, as the Amazon finally started to ease up on hurting him. "Would you take her on? I wouldn't," Pops asked Louis, wiping sweat off himself with a towel he had plucked off the floor. "The Amazon? You shouldn't be fearful of taking on a woman, my friend," Louis replied as he got off the weight machine, then moved to the floor and started doing sit-ups. The next words Pops could think to say on the matter got changed, as an intercom announcement got broadcast throughout the room. "Louis Largo, report to my office now." The words just spoken, being those of their employer, Dr. Claw, made everyone look to Louis. He now, with his elbows resting at the upper base of his knees, sat in the sit-up, frozen in place. "Would you be fearful of taking on Dr. Claw?" Pops asked, changing the direction of the conversation lightly, while watching Louis get up from the floor to standing. "I'd be a fool not to be," Louis stated in reply, looking back to Pops, briefly as he started walking away from the man. Rubbing his muscles as he strode across the room, the wide berth once given to Terry and Annie, now being applied to the large grunt as he walked to the exit. The reason behind this new distance given, not of fear they'd get hurt if they got in his way, but rather as a sign of respect for a man they were all sure would soon be dead. Chapter 3. In Happy Headquarters, in its vast outlay that spreads itself just 1 mile beneath the world's feet, plus to that of a few thousand miles spread across the United States in that respect, In Ida Venture's office, she watched Penny's friends of Fletcher, then Kayla enter her space, then have Penny follow in after them. As the two teenagers felt like outsiders to Happy, took in the surgeon doctor's office like curious owls, twitching their heads about in every direction. Ida took careful hold of Kayla, not that she feared the girl would move something about in her office, but rather to the fact she was well aware by speaking to Penny on the phone, why her friends were here. A safe place away from the feelings of violent acts of non-justified hatred at their school earlier in the day. Fletcher was just there as a supportive friend, plus fear and nervousness shared by the girls to what had happened. Kayla was the bigger case, given she'd been at the event firsthand with Penny and had gotten shot. It's fine, Kayla said, trying to brush off the doctor, as the woman prompted by not only moving the girl to an examining table, but also patting it to insist she lay on it. Are you sure? Ida continued to insist the girl that she knew, while physically only slightly wounded, emotionally, couldn't have been in a very good state. Please just leave me be for the moment, the girl replied, at first looking down. Then, for lack of not knowing how to handle things any better than the prompt she'd been given, got onto the examining table and started to again look around the office. It's quite a nice setup for a practice you've got here. I can see why Penn likes this place, she continued before turning to Fletcher to see he too was taking in the office in his own way. Back from out his backpack that was forced into concealment after other staff of Happy took notice of it. As Fletcher moved with his friends through the complex to Ida Venture's office, he took out his camcorder and started to record the surgeon doctor's office for posterity. Not something he felt was worth the risk of losing his camera over elsewhere in the establishment's HQ. Elsewhere, he'd been threatened that if he used the device, he'd lose it to confiscation. Here, with a woman he knew to be another of Penny's friends, through Penny voicing the fact, he felt sure he could get away with its use. Hopefully, later he thought other staff, not connected with the honey blonde-haired girl, would lighten up about its use once they saw how beneficial it was to them. For his example, he'd put to others on his wanted recordings of them a like button hit on an internet video website many times over. Looking around the office with his gaze focused on that camcorder's viewfinder screen, he frowned a little seeing what was taking place before him. Not a bad event, but one he knew why it was happening, as he had known the same why it had happened to Kayla. Ida was questioning Penny about how she was after what had happened in the school. It feels worse than it was, Penny replied to Ida with her eyes downcast as she said the words. Realizing there had to be more to the words than she ventured to vocalize her guessing on, that the girl had been witness to more than a student losing control of his senses, then hurting one of her friends and another peer, she just replied to Penny with, "We'll talk about that later." From watching the interaction between his master and one of her many teachers, who strangely was one of her friends, Brain walked to Penny from the area in the office he'd been laying in, waiting for her presence. He wasn't quite sure how to approach the girl. He remembered what she'd told him, and what she'd told the co-master over the phone. What had happened to her in her sleep time when he could do nothing to protect her from harm. She'd just been hurt again, and this time not in sleep. He should have been with her, but he had not been. Standing on his hind legs, he nuzzled her with his nose all around her, as far up her as he could reach up to her. She in turn took hold of his paws and rubbed them, smiling down at the dog, before she turned to Ida for answers which she was sure the doctor would have for her, without her having to voice the questions. "I had Jean come by your house once it was decided you'd be here with your classmates. We figured the pooch would help you with this." Ida answered the only question she guessed was on Penny's mind about the presence of her pet. "I thought you didn't want him in your office, or around any medical areas of Happy for that matter," Penny questioned now aloud, as she took her tablet computer out of her backpack and presented it to Brain for his use in communicating with her. "Today it's okay, Penny," she answered the teen, smiling slightly before turning away from her to look at her friends. Kayla taking the quiet but passive inquisitive route to Ida's office, the injured girl was sitting on the exam table and opening up drawers nearby to peer inside them.
to then shut the drawers again after her curiosity was satisfied. Fletcher, while doing exactly what Kayla was, he was also recording his examining of her equipment, plus also noting her medications on hand for quick usage on patients that needed them. The boy's actions bothered her. Penny, realizing that Ida's eyes were on her friends, looked up to Ida as she was getting ready to say her thoughts about the return of Fletcher's camera, plus his hands being more grabby than Kayla's. "Is Fletch holding his camera?" Penny asked the surgeon doctor, who the girl could tell was clearly worried. "He got warned. I remember security's reaction, which is pretty standard with outsiders learning of internal going-ons here in Happy." "Yes, Penny, he's at it again," Ida said, again looking to Penny before returning her attention to her friends, although now more specifically only to Penny's male friend. "He just wants to do a video piece on Happy. I'm sure it will all be harmless in the end what he records," Penny replied to her. "I want to review what he's recorded in the end, and I want security staff to review what he's recorded in the end before it leaves this place," Ida stated before moving to Penny and bending down to her and Brain. Continuing with her thoughts, she asked the teen, "I don't want him or Kayla around my medications, especially the ones containing Datura stramonium and Amanita muscara. Please, when my eyes aren't on them, do—" Penny cut her off in her worried request to relieve her of her professional, but the girl knew unfounded fear. "None of my friends do drugs, and even if they did, they wouldn't know those are compound chemicals known to cause hallucinations." Inside Dr. Claw's office, the leader of MAD stared at Lewis from across his desk for 5 minutes, before he got up from the desk to do the same to the man for another period of time, to the same degree. This made Lewis scared, but showing he was afraid of his employer was something he refused to do. Nothing about his demeanor changed from him when he first entered the office till 10 minutes into being there, when Dr. Claw finally spoke to him. "You have no notable special talents. Some would consider you to be a dumb piling of muscles, nothing more than a minion of sorts to MAD. I do not consider you to be dumb," Dr. Claw told Lewis, as the grunt continued standing before the man, acting as best he could to be a statue created by the Medusa of Greek myth. This quickly changed about him as Dr. Claw continued his speech to the man, questioned him. Putting an armored glove hand on one of his shoulders, Lewis twitched as Dr. Claw said, "You can deceive people. Deception is what you do beyond your strength, and while that is a talent, it does not stand out to me. You do want promotion, correct?" Again, Dr. Claw just stared at Lewis, but unlike his sizing up of the man earlier, not that he expected the other man to talk. It took about 30 seconds for this to sink into the employee's head, what his boss was expecting of him. All Lewis could do in reply, all that he felt he could do, was in the smallest possible voice say, "Yes, sir," without barely moving his lips while doing so. "I need you to do your job. Be deceptive. Make people believe I am here when I am not," Dr. Claw said to Lewis, watching the other man acknowledge his words. That showed nothing to his expression in this acknowledgement but the widening of his eyes. "You want to speak?" the boss questioned him, knowing what the man must be thinking. Lewis nodded his head before his eyes went even wider than they'd been before. He then said softly, "Yes, sir, I'm like to speak. My leave from our headquarters is only temporary. This deception, that is how you will earn your promotion. If you fail to do this job, you will not only be replaced from your employment here, you will no longer be working for MAD the hard way. Understood?" Dr. Claw stated to Lewis, thinking the grunt might have had most of his questions answered about the job being handed to him. Further details still needed clarification. The man knew those details should only be relayed to Lewis. Once he knew, the grunt at least knew the basic principles of the job. "Yes, sir. After replying to his boss that he understood what he'd been told, Lewis still had questions. Plus, he knew there was a chance he could be making a mistake in even asking about them. Could he? Would he even dare? That had started the questioning. He should have never said, because now yet again, Dr. Claw, Lewis knew, was staring at him again from beneath his hat, with its brim slanted to lowering over his eyes. "You question me?" Dr. Claw said coldly, his gravelly voice sounding deeper than normal as he spoke. No, sir. Only what is going on here, sir." Lewis shot out his reply, answering to his boss. The reply not being wanted at all made Dr. Claw clench his armored-gloved hand. This act was caught by Lewis, and knowing what he was about to do could be a mistake he'd regret with his life. He did so anyway. He asked his highest superior not the questions the man thought were on the grunt's mind, but the questions that not only he'd been pondering. His co-workers also had been thinking about as well. "Sir, Dr. Claw, I'm not questioning your orders of me. I'm questioning what we've all been questioning here. Everyone at MAD who doesn't, like myself included, doesn't know what is going on that we question." Seeing his boss unclench his armored glove, Lewis continued his speech after taking a gulp of air in. The power surges and an excess of other oddities that have come up recently unexplainable. Happy as some suspect? Invisible people? I know that sounds nuts, but some people, and I not one of them, think. Dr. Claw interrupted him quickly in stating to him, "Happy, no. We'd be lucky if that were the case. No, old business, I suspect." Feeling like there should be more to this, Lewis now took his turn at eyeing his boss, as opposed to the other way around. Although be it hoped without Dr. Claw noticing it really, as the other man picked up a suitcase, that before he shooed off his cat, the animal had been resting on the whole time while Lewis had been in the office. "Oh, and if you can put a stop to those surges and what they're connected to, your next paycheck will have a lavish number on it," Dr. Claw told him in quickly turning to the grunt. The shock of his boss snapping his attention onto him so suddenly made him feel like he'd taken it physical rather than mental. He felt like he'd been caught in the act of something awful, and given that he was sure it meant he'd be punished with some form of torture, his gut hurting at the thought, nothing seemed to come of it. Dr. Claw was too busy making a final visual inspection of the office as he continued readying his leave of it. When Dr. Claw finally felt satisfied with the state he'd be leaving things in for Lewis with the office, that's when the attack happened from out of the blue. From the far wall of the office it came, Dr. Claw's prize sword, a 2-foot-long blade with elaborate Celtic knotwork covering its hilt, with a skull twisting out from the pattern of the art made from silver. By invisible force it flew through the air at Dr. Claw, and hit the wall just by the man. Lewis turned pale in horror at the sight, not only on it being unexplainable, unprecedented, and strange, but also because since there was clearly no one else visible to blame, the attempted murder of his boss could only be pinned on him. The respectful treatment of him given by his co-workers in the combat training and gym room of what they saw as a death march now was coming true to what it was. Lewis was about to be killed for an attempt on Dr. Claw's life. Having taken notice of the sword that had just whizzed by him, that was now stuck in the wall by him near to the door of the office, Dr. Claw turned to look back at Lewis coldly. Lewis could only spastically pronounce his innocence to him, in hopes what he saw as the inevitable wouldn't happen to him. "I swear I didn't. I'd never, not in a million. I'd never ever even think, never try and kill you. Never. I didn't do it. I swear I didn't do it." Looking from Lewis to the sword and then back to the grunt, calmly, Dr. Claw replied with, "I believe you." Before he left the room with his tabby, Mad Cat trailing after him, leaving Louis Largo dazed in shock, wondering in multiple reasoning directions what just happened. In the section base of Happy headquarters, nearest to Metro City, 2 of its agents just returned from their latest case assignment, however, with extra company in tow. A very unhappy fraud archaeologist. Hancock didn't want to be there. He wanted to be nearly anywhere but this place. He'd been caught red-handed by those agents. What could he do given that? Become a fugitive? And sadly, their lead inspector, thought of as a super agent, had seen through his rogue. This was his end, and he had no one to blame but himself as he wished for his situation to be otherwise. John wished for this situation to be in an otherwise state right now. He wished that he had handled his niece differently in what to her at least had been the early morning. True, what he had now just discovered when trying to report into Chief Quimby had no connection to her bad dream. It was an awful event nonetheless, and he should have been there for her. His chief, his immediate superior, was handling the afterwards of the shooting. Penny had been witness to. He had business of his own, and while talking to Quimby was part of that, it wasn't the only thing he needed to do. He also had to handle Hancock, but thankfully that meant he could do two things at once. Penny, he'd been told, was here, and was with her newest teacher. In fact, the only teacher she dealt with outside of her school. Ida Venture, he'd been told, was looking after Penny currently, and two of her peer friends from school. Ida was a person he needed to see. Ida could handle the dirty archaeologist in a way typical law couldn't. His job, getting her to remove the artifact from the man, also when combined with having a little needed family time with his niece. This worked well, but he still blamed himself for what he couldn't have controlled. When entering the doctor's office along with Alan, who felt he almost had to drag their current case in with them into the room, John spotted the teen after a search which had him looking in every direction, but the one that should have been obvious, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Brain sitting beside her. The girl was talking with the animal through true verbal communication and text-speak, a normal act for them, but to anyone not used to it, that was a matter he had to explain frequently to people outside their normal private life, what the two were doing. Feeling slightly unsure about how to approach her and keeping a distance, the only words he could think to say then, at least to her, were, "I'm sorry." Not the best choice of words, he knew, but he hoped she'd understand their meaning well enough to get what he was attempting to relay to her, without saying anything, but simply looking at him with no emotion, then walking to him and taking him into a half hug. She just stayed with him, then listened to him continue his thoughts to her. The inspector now feeling more mentally organized, with her seemingly accepting of him finally being present for her. "I wonder if that bad dream was some kind of premonition to today," he questioned her, even though he knew such a thing wasn't possible. Ida, watching them, finally felt she was starting to see a missing puzzle piece fall into place, what the inspector's niece was refusing to talk about. Then she noticed something that finally was riding on her nerves so high. She didn't know what to make of it, as she bit her tongue in its observance. Fletcher was recording them. The boy was taking what should have been a very private moment, and was recording it, likely for the whole world to see later online. "Philip, please leave them alone," Ida attempted to request of Fletcher. Noting the request and the complete mistake of the sounding of his name, Fletcher's reaction to the doctor was simply eyeing her for a moment before returning his full attention to his friend and her uncle. John took more notice than the boy did, however, in that of acknowledging seeing him, what he was doing, and looking none too pleased at the teen. Reality show for the internet. My channel has most of Metro City Western High for an audience. Plus some people down south watch this stuff as well, Fletcher told John as the older man glared at him. As Miss Venture said, cut it out. I don't want this recorded for your amusement or anyone else's. Our lives aren't for public broadcast, understand? The inspector requested of the boy evenly. At that, the teenage boy finally complied with the wishes of the two adults present in the room. Not wanting to get confirmation that Penny's uncle could do feats inhuman and harmful to him, he pressed the record button on his camcorder, shutting off its progression of digital taping of the moment of bonding he'd hoped to capture. A touching time lost to the ages. He felt gypped of good footage. Although looking around the room for more to cover in recording, he remembered looking at the inspector's partner and the person he was keeping an eye on. There were more interesting things taking place in the room. The now fixed attention of Fletcher to Allen and Hancock didn't go unnoticed by John. This brought him back to the larger reason he was there. The archaeologist had to be dealt with. Also, the person who claimed ownership to the office had to do most of that dealing with him. Ida, this fraud we've brought in, he needs, cleaning to get back what he stole. I assume you can do that, right? John asked as he parted from Penny softly. then proceeded to focus his attention solely between Earl Hancock and her with his looks. Going pale, Hancock finally spoke up for the first time in hours. "Do you have to? Do you want this done the easy way or the hard way, sir?" Ida replied to him, as she went to an island storage unit, to then pull out one of its drawers and retrieve medicine from it. "Can't we just turn back time here and forget why I'm here?" Hancock asked her, looking squeamish as he looked in her direction. Not to her fully, but to what she was holding. A pill she'd just taken from the bottle of medication she was holding. The pill now resting in the cap to the bottle it had come from. It looked like something even a horse would have trouble swallowing. As Ida replied back with a simple no to him, he groaned. When he finally turned his attention away from the pill bottle, and to his side, he took on a new, more wary expression. He now saw Fletcher with his camcorder pointed right at him. The high school student was smiling at him, as he spoke to not only the dirty archaeologist, but not looking away from the man, Ida. "I want to record this. Please let me record this," Fletcher requested with the red light providing proof on his camera. He truly had no intention of waiting for permission to start the act he was asking about. "Ida?" John asked the surgeon doctor, not knowing how she took to this act, this newest violation of privacy, if it could be called that. The inspector didn't think so, but it was her call if it was okay. It had to be remedied, she knew. The kids couldn't stay in her office for long, not if one of them kept up what he wanted to do. Plus the second, while needing comfort same as Penny, but for different reasoning, didn't seem to need her services. Ida thought briefly to get an answer, and it seemed to fit the bill right what she remembered. Not a pleasant thought at her career be it, but the man would keep the kids out of her hair, plus the other active, happy agents who didn't want them around as well. Fletcher, why don't you leave us be? You, Kayla, and Penny go talk with former leader of the guard for Team Longchamp of Security, Agent Chalopin. I'm sure he wouldn't mind your presence in the least," Ida requested of the teen, as she pushed him away from Hancock to get to the man. Fletcher knew when people truly didn't want him around, but he knew one misstep here could lead to trouble. Penny knew what was happening with him as well. His actions had now gone too far. Luckily, she understood what the woman was hinting at beyond pawning off the children to other company in the establishment. While she knew who the former leader of the guard for Team Longchamp was, Fletcher didn't. She knew he'd likely be pleasantly surprised by the man. Also, his openness would be a good distraction to Kayla over the day's events. Penny, taking her male friend's arm, motioned to him to come with her, then motioned for her more quiet other friend to follow her. Watching the group of high school students leave the office to meet with the former happy agent, John questioned Ida over her recommendation she'd just given. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "Swallow," she told Hancock bluntly as she opened one of his hands, moved the pill from the cap it had been resting in to the opened hand, then with her other hand handed him a cup of water before continuing with stating, "He loves kids, he knows the rules, and he'll be fine with demonstrating his cyborg side. He's simple," the inspector proclaimed. The doctor grimaced at the words before replacing the cap to the bottle of medication she'd been holding, then placing it back where she'd taken it from. The reminder of what she'd done without better knowledge ages ago was not something she wanted to think about. "I'm aware of that, Inspector," she replied to John, trying to look more composed than she had just moments ago. Realizing he'd hit a subject best left buried, John knew he'd again fouled up this day, but hopefully the right words would fix that. Hopefully that won't be a problem. "And I can't thank you enough that by the time you guys worked on me, I didn't turn out like him," he told her, hoping the success of her work and her team's work on him would make her feel better. "It's because of advances in understanding the brain how you got lucky, John. Back when Chalopin became a cyborg, we didn't know as much. Part of that third brain of yours that is what helps control your gadgets. To him, it's his main brain now. He can control his devices with extreme dexterity and skill, but as for the rest of how he functions, I just wish I could turn back time, she replied to him at first with her eyes downcast, then focusing to him, then to elsewhere, the subject still making her feel uncomfortable, despite the man's attempt to make her feel better about her work. I think I feel it working, the archaeologist stated, shifting around a little. Moving away from Hancock with a slight sound of concern in his voice, Alan asked, "Other subjects, guys? Ida, anything new we might be interested in hearing about that happened while we were gone on our case assignment?" "Well, the day hasn't been all bad." Ida started to relay what she'd heard from elsewhere, from other agents before she got interrupted with, "Says you," Hancock shouted at her, before the doctor continued, without verbal reply. The remaining group in the room stared at the upset archaeologist for a few seconds. The two agents who worked more out in the field for Happy felt tired of him before he'd stepped foot in the office. The agent who spent most of her time in the office now had enough of him. "Today hasn't been all bad. Rumor has it Mad is experiencing matters so foul, Dr. Claw is considered leaving it." "How confirmed is it Mad is experiencing problems?" John asked her, feeling very skeptical over the rumor she'd just voiced. Shrugging her shoulders as she spoke, Ida answered John with, "It's hard to tell since this intelligence has only been found out by spying on identified Mad agents working out in the field. Only going into Mad could confirm such a thing, and the captured agents refuse to talk. Has anyone ever been in Mad's HQ to investigate matters with them before?" the inspector asked, now feeling intensely curious about the information she was dispensing out. "No," came Ida's reply, plain and simple. Looking to Hancock sitting down on the examining table, which had been formerly used by Kayla, biting his lower lip for a moment, before turning his attention to his partner out in the field and friend. Alan asked John, "Are we going to check out Mad's HQ, John? I can see those wheels of yours turning. I'd be a poor inspector if I didn't. Facts always need to put rumors to rest, and Mad losing its leader and experiencing troubles is definitely worth discovery of the truth," John said with a little smile on his face. Chapter 4. Coming up and through the launch tunnel built into the very top of Mount Everfrost, the Madmobile, Dr. Claw's rocket car, made itself known to every presence outside the mountain, fast. The thundering of its jet engines when breaching through the cavern leading to Mad's headquarters caused the snow atop the mountain to break loose, and tumbling down the face of it, find those presents. In massive chunks of icy snow, the Gadgetmobile got beaten by the avalanche, caused by the exiting rocket car. In massive chunks of icy snow, the Gadgetmobile got beaten by the avalanche, caused by the exiting rocket car. The rain of snow beating in against the car sitting on the narrow mountain road leading into the headquarters of Happy's rival establishment. Coming in on the vehicle in varying waves of sizes, this led Alan, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, to again point out what he thought was a good idea, using one of the modded Supra's gadgets to help them out. John, knowing his partner's enthusiasm too well, wouldn't have any of it. Turning up the heater to the car, John proclaimed his thoughts about the entombing blanket of snow covering them. "We are at our destination. We don't need to fly, period. Also, given how the whole body of the car can superheat off snow and ice, in about an hour or so we should be free. Your stubbornness is amazing sometimes. No, I don't want to see it fly right now, but the wings would break apart the snow, freeing us up a 10-foot path in two directions," the engineer shot back at the inspector semi-politely, taking the moment to do what the other man saw as unthinkable, and yet he knew it was coming. The fellow Happy agent pressed the newly installed button on one of the dashboards of the car. That activated its transformation into mini-jet mode. After what was thought of as the normal sounds both men associated with the car converting to a hovercraft of grinding metal, hissing, and clicking, they watched as the shifting inside the car's frame pushed itself out to form its wings out to both sides of the machine. Alan grinned as the wings transformation concluded. Looking to John as he did so, Much to the man's pride, he caught a smile of bemusement on John's face, before he turned to see Alan's grin. That's when his face dropped back to his normal one of disapproval, to his co-worker's impulsive actions. After the engineer turned away from the inspector, knowing despite catching him enjoying what the car had done successfully, the man somehow was still annoyed by him. The car continued on to further transform itself into its jet form. Once that was completed, Alan, leaning against the door, looking out the window nearest him, finished his statement of reasoning, and a path to the rear of 5 feet and 3 inches. While we have this little bit of time, we could contemplate what just occurred. Dr. Claw just left Mad, John said, and worming lightly in his seat to get comfortable in it. Look out the window again, Alan replied non-enthusiastically, taking the engineer's advice of looking out the window at the small path created by the car's left wing. Snow still being present, but not looking as the chilling death it had a short time ago. The inspector then looked back at the sulking man, now no longer making eye contact at him. Opening the car's driver's side door with some force to break the snow trapped at its base, John snapped Alan out of his moping for lack of appreciation for his work. A reminder of the man's other handiwork being brought into the inspector's speech, as he activated one of his own gadgets to help things out. "Only because you recently gave me a way to counteract this," John said as he used his blowtorch against the snow surrounding them. The act only justified completely because of his newest built-in gadget, a water gun, that John was amazed Happy had never thought about giving him access to from the start of his life with them. 6 of Mad's grunts stood in Dr. Claw's office, looking at the handiwork of the 7th of their collective, the work of Lewis, in trying to fool others not present except his best friend, not present, that their boss, who had recently flown the coop, was still there. "Do you guys think it will work?" Lewis asked, turning to them, and switching his attention around as best he could to all of them. His work he knew had been done half-fast, but given lack of advance notice of his mission assignment, he felt sure what effort had been given surely was worth something. A copy of the Claw's armored glove resting on the armrest to his chair, with the chair not facing the door. It could work, he assumed. Then he got his critique from his co-workers on the same level of the work ladder as himself. "Lou, according to what you've told us, none of us should even know you've done this," Fred pointed out with his reply. "That could work so long as no one turns the chair around to face, Dr. Claw, to discover it's only a copy of his armored glove," Pops pointed out in his answer to the question. "What if a bomb was placed in the chair and was triggered by the chair being turned? Then the person would be none the wiser and be dead," Slick suggested in his reply, motioning with his hands as he did so of what he wanted to see happen. Just a little surprised by Slick's answer/suggestion. Not too surprised, given he tended to act a little more randomly violent than the rest of them at times. Lewis countered his comrade's thoughts with his own, feeling what he thought of the proposed idea could lead to problems unforeseen, at least to Slick. That would destroy the office, and none of us would want that. "You wouldn't want that. The rest of us weren't even in this room, remember?" Jarvis stated, eyeing Lewis with a look the other man felt was unfounded slightly. A look of superiority which didn't benefit the man at all, given they both held the same job status. Annoyed by his co-worker's helpfulness, Lewis took a moment longer than normal to notice the atmosphere in the room wasn't all right. That is, beyond the clear problem he was facing. What had just interrupted the meeting of the goons was an alert signal, beeping and light blinking from a button from a setup built into Dr. Claw's desk. A security monitoring setup that only he, the boss of them all, was meant to access. That now, for the first time in their careers for MAD, the employees of low status were seeing for the first time. Tentatively, Lewis pressed the blinking button to see what would happen upon its pressing. The result he saw, one soon seen also by his present co-workers gathering around him, shocked all of them in the contents displayed on the monitor, which connected to the formerly blinking button. MAD had just been infiltrated for the first time in its history, And at that, by a pair of very unwelcomed guests likely. Maybe it's Terry, one of them? Bruce questioned, pointing a finger onto the monitor screen. The surges in power causing him, like the others present, to wonder what he was seeing with a jittering screen. Lewis started to grit his teeth, watching one of the visitors on the screen. He didn't question who they were, especially one of them, watching where the rocket car had exited MAD, a long tunnel burrowing downwards. He focused on the cyborg, carefully finding handholds in odd places along its curving wall. The wall which wasn't built for climbing. A mesh-mash of rock, and concrete and openings. The Happy Inspector called Gadget, climbing down for a short while before his foe for the ages. The Happy Inspector's partner, the thorn that he'd wish would just die. The normal, but for his self-made superpowers which weren't built into him. Enginus, the average build, 5'8" tall, in-height man, who had defeated Lewis more than once in fights. Lewis being proud of his height of 6 feet, plus to boot with a BMI of 29, with his weight of 215 pounds, most of which being muscle to his frame, and not fat, saw the engineer using his cape to fly down the tunnel. I doubt that for 2 reasons, Lewis answered Bruce, almost growling as he did so, before continuing to his explanations that left the inflections of hate out of his voice. 1. Terry, last to my knowledge, is just about courting death, with that strange attraction he and the Amazon seem to be having with each other. Also, I think Terry is not only still recovering from fighting her, but likely is fruitlessly trying to find her flowers. 2. The second one, the flying. I'm damn sure I know who that is. His presence could only mean the climber has to be Inspector Gadget, and not our cyborg pal. Orders? Fred asked Lewis, that then, at his head turning to the man, the rest of the other goons did the same action, hopeful for direction from their temporary fake boss. Do nothing to the intruders yet. First, I want to send the zoo crew security robots on level 1 on them. It is their duty to attack intruders after all. Then we'll fight them if the bots can't handle them. Lewis stated his reply, none too happy about the situation, but feeling like he was handling it correctly as he told his coworkers the orders. As Lewis readied himself to leave the room, for the brief time it would take him to reach the room in which lay the controls to activate the robots, Pops questioned him. Before you go, since you're being privy to information the rest of us aren't, why past the surges are things getting weird in the deeper levels of the complex? Plus, also that funny smell that seems to be getting stronger. I don't know, but I have a promised sweet paycheck if I can fix it, Lewis answered, holding on to the doorframe to Dr. Claw's office for a moment, before leaving sight of his comrades in the office. Intrigued by the security monitoring setup normally never seen in access to anyone but the big boss, Jarvis started pressing the buttons, which lit up the other monitors in the small machine station built into the desk. Anyone want to see where else Claw can personally monitor throughout HQ? He questioned the gang around him, seeing what they had before not known their boss could keep an eye on elsewhere inside Mount Everfrost. They all concluded verbally, and at nearly the same time. They couldn't believe Dr. Claw kept tabs on one of the places shown on one of the screens. After Jarvis pressed another button to light up yet another security screen, Fred exclaimed he'd never go into the newly revealed by camera place being watched again unless ordered to. Why don't you just extend your legs down to the ground? Or better yet, why didn't you just break out your helicopter unit? It's packed in a case in the car, Alan asked, swooping in the air around John, as the other man's right foot, in picking, found another crevice in the wall to wedge into. Looking down for only a moment forced the inspector to answer his friend's question in depth. The view is making me feel a touch of vertigo and lightly nauseous. A bad combo, I think, to doing either feat. The climbing down keeps my mind off both of those. The answer given as the man with his focus trying not to be on what he'd just stated slipping, causing him to feel more sick than he had been already, and now going ever so slightly pale. Yeah, I'm feeling a little queasy myself, and I can smell something in the air that might be causing that. I'm sure you can handle it. Just think, you're not swooping through the air right now," Alan replied back to him, floating to John and placing a hand on his shoulder. "Not helping, Alan," John stated, now looking worse off than he had when they'd started talking about the subject. At hearing sounds of mechanical movement, both men looked to each other. Alan broke away from contact with John. John stopped thinking about how ill the descent was making him feel, and now listened to the noises as sharply as he could, internally adjusting his hearing level as he attempted to figure out what it was he was listening to. "John?" Alan requested to the fellow happy agent. "It's not me," John replied to the engineer, still listening to the sounds, now not moving at all, staying in one place fixed to the wall. "Then what is it? What can your amplified sense of hearing pick up?" Alan further questioned, looking over, twisting his head ever so unnaturally to the engineer. Frowning at the man was all it took for John to relay to him. He didn't want to look and see the sound source. That, despite feeling a little better in his climb down the shaft, he still couldn't look down. Again, with no words spoken but relayed once more in motioning, Alan pointed out he'd check out what was making the sounds of mechanical movement, now growing ever louder in their ears. The sight below him shocked him when he spotted it. Two robotic beasts of clear design of what they were meant to represent, a gorilla and a monkey, having just then entered into standing and staring at the men. The center of the floor, to which the men were descending to, now had mechanical apes waiting for them in it. "What is it?" the inspector asked, wondering why the engineer had gone wide-eyed in his gaze to the ground he refused to look at. "We don't have a choice, John. We'll just have to deal with it when we get to the floor," the tech answered with his voice cracking a little, feeling too stunned by the view he'd just taken in to know how to properly vocalize it. Although waiting to discover what the other man meant by his words didn't take long. The gorilla took the initiative then, and bounded up and off the curving wall to get to John. The tackle happened so fast, the inspector couldn't think fast enough to combat the new weight grabbing at him. The fall that resulted from the robot ape and part robot man was that of a stone, fast, and with worrying feeling in John that he'd soon be a pancake to the ground with the bullet speed he was falling at. Luckily for him, the gorilla weighed more than he did, and gravity forced it into the better position as to not force the inspector into a flattened shape. When the two crashed to the floor, the inspector finally saw his opponent, the robot gorilla, while having no flexible metal in its face. John could still swear more an expression on it, pure detest for him. Moving out from under the happy agent and grabbing one of the man's legs while doing so, the mechanical beast, treating the leg as if it were a whip, bashed the inspector against the ground in a swinging motion. The words of "holy crap" jumping into his mind as he hit the ground again, not verbally spoken since the impact forced the air in his lungs out of them in a painful rush. Turning around to face the beast as fast as he could, with mental command he exposed his laser gadget and fired it at the robot into its head. After the smoke and sparks cleared from the side of the massive mechanical beast's head, John saw its response to his attempt to defend himself against it. Nothing but a look that still seemed annoyed by him, and movement up to him. Snorting exhaust from its nostrils appeared to be its only way to show a further expression of its mood, before it grabbed the inspector by his midsection and threw him against the wall. Now having semi-gotten used to being thrown around like a ragdoll by the beast, having a little bit of air in his lungs, John finally spoke up and to himself over his predicament. "This has not been a good day so far," he said just before trying a new act on the robot in combat. That, while weird, he figured was worth a shot. He fired his new water gun gadget at it, hoping it might short-circuit the machine. All the act did was send water dripping down the face of the mechanical beast, and nothing more. The fight was not going well, and looking to Alan, who had rushed to his defense, Alan's fight didn't appear to be going much better. The robot monkey was on the man's back, clawing at him in a fruitless effort to cause physical harm. His focus divided between his own fight with the small metal simian, and attempting to try and make his way over to John. The fight given by the monkey, not just hard by its location on Alan and its claws, but also what was coming from its back. Somehow, in between licks against him with its energy conducting, lit up like a fluorescent blue flexible bolt tail, that, without breaking his skin under the protection awarded by his cape, still managed to cause him pain. Guessing at the reasoning behind this, the engineer was sure that had to do with whatever form of electricity the machine was inflicting on him. It being technology and his cape being technology as well. A conflict of interacting devices, Alan managed to get out the words to his coworker of, "You used your water gun? I figured it would short-circuit the thing," John proclaimed his answer to the other man in the shout. The robot gorilla now attempting to run and grab at John as he ran and ducked it at every turn it made. His mind working fast to come up with a truly working answer to once and for all really being able to do damage to the man-made creature. Deciding it was futile to try and harm the engineer with its claws, the monkey tried a new tactic on it, inflicting pain on Alan. In observation to its efforts to hurt him so far, it started to wring its tail around him, rapping and whipping at him as it held on to him. Grabbing backwards to the mechanical simian, Alan got a hold of the false monkey and threw it off of him with as much force as he could muster. Sadly, without knowing it, this was a short-sighted act. For when he threw the monkey off him, it wasn't just simply holding onto his back at the time. It was also holding on to his cape. With Alan's own actions, he'd just thrown his attacker and his defense across the room. He was no longer wearing his cape, now held in one of the 4 paws of the metal monkey, some yards away from him. Feeling utterly helpless, Alan did the first thing that rang to mind. He attempted to ask John for help. "I have a problem of my own to deal with, Alan, but I'll try to get to you shortly. I now have an idea how to handle this," John replied to him as the robot gorilla tried to punch the inspector's head into the wall shortly behind him. The action fortunately missed by the man with quick reflexes used. Using the springs built into his legs, John jumped up to a higher part of the shaft they were in, the action bringing him to a height in it almost to the point that he'd fallen from a short time ago, thanks to his opponent. Seeing good places for hand and footholds fast, he then fixed himself back into the wall of the room. He hoped this tactic of his would work. Looking below him, he waited to see if the gorilla would jump off the wall and bounce again to reach him once more, with his attention for the moment fixed on seeing what he considered a rare sight, what his friend and coworker had just done. Alan smiled at the sight of the man now at what he guessed to be a vertical distance of 400 feet above him. The engineer soon lost attention to pride in his work, when his other work got pointed back to his attention. The robotic monkey making chirping noises was signaling him to look at it. The small metal simian was holding his cape, plus waving it around towards him, as if doing an impression of a matador to egg him into coming after it. The egging wasn't hard to do with Alan in wanting to take back his defense, as he started after the tiny man-made beast, just as its larger brother of sorts started to spring up after John high above them both. The pair of apes emotionless but driven. The pair of men not emotionless and driven the need to survive. Fear in both of them due to many factors of present in their predicament, John hoped that his plan would work, and at least one fear would soon be taken care of. When the massive mechanical beast reached John, it took hold of him and tried to pull him from the wall a second time. This time the happy agent knew what was coming for him, and was prepared. He'd sunk in one of his hands and both of his feet deeply into the cracks. He'd quickly located in the curving wall shortly after jumping up to it. The metal beast could not break him free of it this time. Turning around his head backwards to a degree that would snap a normal human's neck, he looked at the gorilla, before moments later dodging the free hand he had not trapped into the wall, activating his laser gadget in the hand, and firing at the beast with shots he tried to control at the thing. "Alan, move away from the center of the floor now," John shouted at the other man below him by hundreds of feet, the inspector making the demand of the engineer, as he finally got a good directed aim on where he meant to shoot at his attacker trying to grab him free of the wall. "Got you," Alan answered back at him, tired of playing with the engineer as if he were a bull in jumping around floor to evade his strikes at it. The monkey finally dropped the man's cape and went again, straight for the man, when in desperation Alan jumped and slid on the floor for his protective garment. The monkey yet again jumped onto his back, seeing an opportunity. It now danced on the man's back, slapping him wildly with its current-charged tail. Laser shooting off the robotic beast's fingers one by one, John hoped his plan would work. True, the ape had taken a dive before, and landed on its back to the ground below earlier. But this time it would fall from a much higher height than the last time. Hopefully, John thought, as the false creature finally could no longer hold on to him for lack of digits, started to fall away from him. It would just break apart this time when hitting the ground, or become so badly damaged it couldn't operate anymore. In either case, a win. Just as the pain he was feeling felt unbearable, Alan finally took hold of his cape in one hand. Him and his protection laying on the floor, still feeling the electricity ripping through his body, he couldn't move fast enough to tuck the cape into the back of his shirt to activate its software. In turning around a little to try and do the act, he saw the gorilla in the final feet of its fall smack into the concrete floor. This had a side effect not predicted by the inspector and dangerous to the engineer. The impact of the large mechanical beast to the floor didn't simply smash it to bits, or just cause it to cease functioning. It caused the massive metal creature to punch a massive hole straight through the center of the ground, the floor caving way as the act happened. The monkey, catching this sight of its crashing partner too late, couldn't get out of danger's way. It fell with its partner. The partner to the inspector, now not completely concerned with fixing his cape into his shirt, now holding on to the remaining cement of the floor as best he could. The fall in crashing could be heard for what felt like eons to the two happy agents. John's level of fear now was higher than it had been before, with his friend/coworker in greater danger than before. Danger he had just placed him in due to unforeseen consequences to his actions. John rushed to the man's aid in those moments that felt to drag on forever. Alan's time of stilled eternity of fear, not from his actions of moments ago, but of the time of the present. His grip on the cement wasn't very good, and the crashing sounds he could hear of the falling robot, those told him his fall, if he couldn't hold his position, would be a very long one. "John?" Alan asked the inspector, too afraid to move. "Hold on," the inspector answered in a shout back at the man. Stunned by his friend's logic, Alan, wide-eyed, answered with, "Like I have a choice." Fixing himself once again into the surrounding wall and extending one arm out beyond its normal length to reach Alan, John requested, "Take my hand." Moving carefully and still managing to keep hold of his cape in clutched fingers, Alan slowly made his way over to the outreached hand, which at the same time, it too moved in closer towards him, as John stretched it out to him further. The floor, while a short time ago completely stable, now quaked lightly with each movement made by the engineer. The sandy-haired man sweated now for the first time on this chosen mission assignment, as he crossed his fingers mentally with each movement he made. It wouldn't be his last. Finally having made his way over to the outstretched hand of hope that would deliver him out of mortal danger, Alan realized that there was a problem with how he had to pursue getting rescued. One false move, true, would have him dead, but at the same time, one false move in poor planning could cost him something else. Knowing his co-worker needed to be informed of a slight delay in him being rescued, Alan made a request for the first time since having his life put in peril, in a calm voice. "Hold on 1 second," vocalized just before he fished his cape, by what he could carefully reach, into his mouth, before continuing through clenched teeth with "okay." Reaching then with both hands now free, Alan took hold of John's outstretched hand to him, letting the man help take him to a more safer area of the launch tunnel room to be in. The both of them now away from the great punched hole created by the robot. John hoped now had been demolished by its impact to a level in MAD headquarters, where gravity had finally let it be laid to rest on. Looking to the engineer for happy, carefully tuck his cape into the back of his shirt's collar, the inspector to a point couldn't believe what he was witnessing. After what both of them had been through, Alan still felt the need to protect himself with his. As John thought of it, and would never voice to the other man, that the cape was his idea of a security blanket. The only thing the inspector could think to say to the tech at seeing this was, "Really?" "My superpowers aren't built in," Alan replied just after he'd finished adding in the cape back into his attire. Before he added in question, looking around the curved room. "Left? Right? Down?" Even controlled down not being how I really want to pursue this investigation with you." "When you saw the monkeys coming, did you catch from which way they came?" John questioned him, remembering that he had been the one to first lay eyes on the pair of now formally attacking robots. After thinking for a moment, Alan answered him with, "They were about mid-center here, I think." It feels like a bit of a blur the last few minutes, John. I'm sorry." The taller, dark brown-haired man, after looking around for a little, then pointing with one hand, answered the other man's question. "That way looks less dangerous. We'll go that way." As the two men carefully made their way out of the launch area for Claw's rocket car, Alan decided he had to vocalize a point which he felt was prominent about their situation. "John, I don't think anywhere in here is safe for us. MAD headquarters, remember?